The worship theme for the month of November is change. And on past Sundays, we've talked about the changes at a local, personal, and even global level. Today, we're going to emphasize the changes in our religion, Unitarian Universalism. And I want to give some credit to some of the ideas in this sermon of mine to a Reverend Christina Leon Tracy, who preached a sermon on this subject in 2015. If you've been a Unitarian Universalist for a while, either at this church or at another church or another fellowship, you may have heard the gentleman Francis David. The background story is that after the Reformation started in 1517, that's when Martin Luther began to break away from the Catholic Church, a king of a region would have to decide what religion he'd support. In Western Europe, there were three competing religions: Roman Catholic, Calvinist, and Lutheran. The bad news was that each religion was in total opposition to the others, to the point of violent persecution. And as kings changed, so did the country's religion. A country could flip from being Catholic to being Lutheran with a new king. And everything would change, and there would be a lot of tension. Sounds a lot like midterm elections to me. For a very short time, religious toleration was the rule of the land in 16th century Transylvania. The newly crowned King John Sigismund found himself ruling a country deeply divided in religious factions between the Roman Catholics, the Calvinists, and the Lutherans. Among the king advisors was a court preacher named David Ferenc, known to the West as Francis David. King Sigismund's son was unable to choose one religion. So David suggested, why don't we allow all Christian religions to be practiced freely here and practice their faith in Transylvania? The result of this from the king was the Edict of Torda, issued by the king, and it said that religious tolerance of these three groups would be the rule of the land. But Francis David was a religious seeker. He had a lot of questions, and he began to have doubts in the Holy Trinity and became a Unitarian. He believed that there was one God, not three separate. Francis David then argued with the king that Unitarianism, which was growing in size, be allowed as the other Christian religions were at that time, and it was included. So Unitarian took on an equal footing with the Catholics, the Calvinists, and the Lutherans in Transylvania. But a few months after allowing Unitarianism to peacefully exist in Transylvania, the king died without leaving an heir. And the king who came in was a Catholic. But the Catholic couldn't undo or evoke the Edict of Torda. But he found a loophole. He said all four Christian religions could continue and would be protected as long as the religion did not stray from its teachings at the time of the edict. If a religion changed at all, it would no longer be protected. Here's the problem. David was a seeker, could not stop his religious questionings. He was always searching and seeking what was true. He started to doubt the sacraments of infant baptism, the nature of communion, the worship of Jesus, predestination. He kept doubting this, and he kept wondering, and he kept preaching about it. His fellow Unitarians were frightened because if he started straying too far from the basic tenets of the Unitarianism at the time of the edict, they would be doomed. But David couldn't stop. He kept preaching about it. And then he was arrested. and found guilty of the crime of religious innovation. He was in prison, sentenced to life, and died in a dungeon in 1579, guilty of innovation. The Unitarian Church in Transylvania was forced into a position of doctrinal stagnation that lasted over 200 years. But our observation is from our beginnings in the mid-1500s, we have been a religion of seekers, a religion of innovators, a religion of embracing changes that may bring us closer to the truth with a capital T. Unitarianism returned in a new form to the United States and the U.S. colonies. Growing along, it went through evolutions, and in 1841, Unitarianism was an emerging faith, promoting that you could be a faithful Christian while not believing in the Trinity. The Unitarian congregations at that time were composed of wealthy industrialists, well-educated members, and those who were reading the Bible for inspirational messages rather than literally. But like many other periods in our religious history, there were contrarians. Those ministers and congregations who began questioning the institution that was forming and the growing rigidity of the structure of Unitarianism. Those people were finding connections with God through nature, personal experiences, the transcendentalist, and outside of a structured Sunday service. Enter Theodore Parker, arguably the most famous and popular Unitarian preacher of his day. He had a weekly congregation of over 3,000 people. 3,000 people before sound equipment, before amplifiers, 3,000 people. Parker could speak over 20 languages. And why did my screen just go blank? There we go. Parker could speak over 20 languages. He was an outspoken abolitionist who famously said that he had a loaded pistol in his desk at all times in case someone tried to interfere with his work. At his desk, on his death, his personal library was one of the largest in the country, 50,000 volumes. And as they started going through it, there were notes and scribbles in all the books. Parker was an extraordinary person in any age. And he delivered a sermon on the ordination of another Unitarian minister in May 19, 1841, titled, quote, "A Discourse on the Transient and the Permanent in Christianity." All seminarians who study to be a UU minister, this is required reading, and we have to read it and we have to understand it and know the message in it. Parker started that sermon with the biblical scripture from Luke 31, verse 33. "Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away." He goes on to say, in this sentence, we have a very clear indication that Jesus of Nazareth believed that religion he taught would be eternal, and that the substance of it would last forever. Parker then preached for over an hour. Oh my God, those were the days. Parker then preached for over an hour on how the transient of Unitarianism had begun to overshadow the permanence of what Christianity was based on. The permanent being the word of Jesus, the transient being all else. Parker called most aspects of Christianity as transient as he preached. Quote, "It must be confessed, though with sorrow, that transient things form a great part of what is commonly taught as religion. An undue place has often been assigned to forms, doctrines, while too little stress is be laid on the divine life of the soul, love to God, love to man. Religious forms may be useful and beautiful. They are so, whenever they speak to the soul and answer a want thereof. In our present state, some forms are perhaps necessary, but they are only the accidents of Christianity, not its substance. They are the robe, not the angel. And the angel may take another robe, quite as becoming and quite useful. Parker's words were very upsetting to the audience of Unitarians who were beginning to be more and more embedded in comfort in a very predictable religion. He goes on to say, anyone who traces the history of what is called Christianity will see that nothing changes more from age to age than the doctrines taught as Christian and insisted upon as essential to Christianity and personal salvation. What is falsehood in one province passes for truth in another. The heresy of one age is orthodoxy in the next. And the only infallible rule will change. Men are burned for professing what men are burned for denying. For centuries, the doctrines of Christians were no better than, say the least, those of their contemporary pagans. Not well received. After the sermon, Parker was shunned by the Unitarian establishment. He was asked to resign from the clergy, but his congregation of 3,000 members was a little too much to lose. He was banned from every Unitarian pulpit except his own. And even though you've heard me say more than once, everything changes, I also believe there are some core permanent foundations in Unitarian Universalism. What are they? What do we hold as permanent? And what do we really have to see as transient? Well, let's look backwards in time. Let's glance at the different phases, different evolution of Unitarianism. Unitarianism back in 1841, it was a Christian religion, differing only that there was a disbelief in the Trinity. By the early 1900s, we were a Christian religion, rational thinking, and a liberal interpretation of the Bible. Not literal, but liberal. Then another half a century passes. By the mid-1950s, this was a humanist religion with no reference to spirituality, God, or divinity, putting our emphasis on science and technology and growing social justice focus. During that time, we also changed our language to be non-church. Altars became tables. Sanctuaries became halls. Pulpits became lecterns. Sermons became talks. Churches became fellowships and societies. 1961, the Unitarians and the Universalists merged together, agreeing to be a non-creedal faith, not exclusively Christian anymore, welcoming other religious beliefs. By the late 1900s, we had become a hodgepodge of ever-widening beliefs, welcoming a large variety of people. And at this point, we weren't really sure how to be welcoming without looking like a social club, where anything goes, a place where you can believe whatever you like. Today we continue to change. We are more aware that we are an organized religion with a very long history. We have factions, like always, that disagree with the structure. We have people who disagree with the UUA and what they're doing. We have people who disagree with the General Assembly and the annual event and how that's run. We are people who are in violent disagreement on the process of requiring ministerial certification. But if Theodore Parker walked in here and spent some time getting to know us deeply, I believe he would find the core, the permanence that he preached about in 1841. He would find a permanent core that allows for innovation and change. A faith with a permanent emphasis on people, service, and love. Emphasis on people whose inherent worth and dignity calls us to welcome and accept and learn from others who are different from ourselves. Emphasis on service, which calls us to act on social justice issues that are just unjust. Emphasis on love, calling us to right relationships with each other and the wider community. People, service, and love. He would find here a faith that welcomes and embraces differences. A faith that allows for disagreement. A faith that allows for innovation and change. A faith that embraces rational thought and analysis. A faith with freedom of the pulpit where I get to preach what I believe is true. And a freedom of the pew where you don't have to agree with me. Our hymnals are transient. This building is transient. This acreage, over 3 acres we have out here, transient. Ministers are transient. Policies, bylaws, procedures, guidelines, they're all transient. Sunday morning services, and sometimes we call it the sandwich. Hymn, sermon, hymn. Transient. All our committees are transient. Even if all those transient aspects, all those forms go away, Unitarian Universalism will remain because of what has been permanent in this religion throughout the ages. What about you? Are you the same person you were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 40? I can go higher up with some of you. Are you the same person? Have you changed? I have. But what has changed in you? If you change your hair, your clothes, your weight, your address, aren't you the same person? Down deep, aren't you the same person you've always been? There are many transient aspects to your life. But don't you have a core of who you are down deep that's permanent? It's been there all along, permanently. May we recognize that while the transient aspects of Unitarian Universalism and our life are comforting, and they're necessary to exist, but they will change. And my prayer is that we're all guilty of the crime of innovation. May we also see that regardless of the changes that we go through, we come from centuries of holding on to the permanent, which is our emphasis and action on people, service, and love. Amen, and blessed be.